If you're considering moving to Alaska, if you currently live here, or if you're just passively interested in what's going on in real estate in general, you doubtlessly want to know what's going on across the entire board here in Alaska. And that is what I do every month. We're going to be looking at Anchorage, we're going to be looking at the MatSu Valley, we're going to be looking at Fairbanks, and we're going to be looking at the Kenai Peninsula, looking just at the residential stuff today. Before we get started, do make sure you give this video a like, do subscribe so you can receive more information like this in the future. And let's go ahead and jump into today's market update looking at the entire state. Now, the first thing we're going to look at is what's going on in the active inventory for real estate in Anchorage. So this is the largest market we have in the entire state. Okay, so largely how Anchorage goes, that's gonna, not always, but that's gonna have a big bearing on what's going on in the rest of the state for the most part. So what we see is that there was a return to some seasonality as far as the active inventory in Anchorage goes. It was starting to see kind of an increase for inventory going into the summer and a little bit into the autumn month as well. But this time this year, we're actually seeing kind of a bit of a drop from what we saw this time last year. Because this time last year, there's about 493 properties that were available on the market. Now it's about 410, 415. So despite starting to see some return to some seasonality instead of just this crazy, dropping, we're starting to see kind of a decrease in the inventory that's available in Anchorage year over year at least. So that's still really low from what we've seen in previous years. This isn't like a huge precipitous drop like what we've seen before, but it is a trend I want to keep a close eye on. Maybe it's just this 1 month, but that's definitely something we want to keep an eye on. The second thing we see for Anchorage is the number of properties that actually sold went from about 360 the year before, roughly about 330 this year, I should say. So not too unsurprisingly, we see kind of a compression for the number of properties that are available. We're going to start seeing a bit of a dip in the properties that are actually selling. So not a huge surprise there. Now, average sold price, not surprisingly, went from about $424,000 this time last year to about $458,000 this year, which is about a 7.9% increase. So this is interesting because instead of seeing kind of a sloughing off, kind of a deceleration of the rate at which things are increasing, I've always said I don't expect to see a big dropping off in the market, like suddenly everything's on a fire sale. But what we are seeing is that instead of the rate at which things are going up is decreasing. In other words, this time last year, it increased by 6.9%. Now it's going up by 7.9%. I would have thought it would have dropped down to about 5% increase, not going down. So we might have been able to buy a house for $400,000 this year. Going at the same rate, would have thought about $430. Now it's only $420. It's still a $20,000 increase. But we are seeing an actual increase of the rate at which things are increasing. We'll see if this is just kind of a fluke and see how that shakes out the rest of the year here. But that continues to be a pretty interesting trend just because we do see interest rates going up, and you would think that would really rein it in, and we're starting to really see a decrease going on there. But that's just not what the statistics show. The next place we're going to look at is the MatSu Valley. This continues to be a pretty interesting market because this is where most of the new construction goes on in the entire state. So this time last year, there's about 413 properties that were available on the market. Now it's about 511. So what I suspect is we are seeing more and more new constructions coming onto the market, and this is really starting to, I'm not going to say skew it, but it starts to make it, the number of properties that are available are going up, but if you're just looking for a resale property, I suspect the options are probably staying about the same or maybe even shrinking a little bit just because the new construction is taking a bigger and bigger part of the overall market share. If you want new construction, that's great. This is the place to be. And the next thing that we see is the number of properties that have actually sold in the MatSu Valley went from about 233 the year before to about 210. So this is a trend I want to keep a pretty close eye on because we are seeing inventory going up, number of properties that have sold going down a little bit. And I suspect that's probably because these new construction homes, they usually don't sell on the first day. It takes a little bit of time for them to actually sell because they're going for the absolute top end of the market for what they can get. And they're very unlikely to be making price drops. So, that's a trend we do want to keep a close eye on, but not entirely unexpected because the number of people looking for new construction is not going to be as big of a pool as those who are looking for resale because there's a lot more predictability with resale. It's a lot easier of a process overall, and they overall get a lot more control over the process of buying a resale home versus new construction. I don't know if you've ever bought a home before. Working with a builder can kind of sound a little bit like a misnomer. I've kind of felt sometimes like it's working for a builder when you're trying to buy one, but that might just be my skewed experience. Now, the next thing we see is the average sold price in the MatSu Valley has gone up approximately 10%, 10.66 if I recall correctly, because it went from about 348,000 this time last year to about 385,000 this time this year. So that's doing pretty good, especially for a year to date. That's doing pretty good. It's one of the most aggressive increase for the average sold price in residential across the entire state, if not the most aggressive. And I think, again, a lot of that has to do with the new construction that's going on in the MatSu Valley, because those are going to be selling at the top end. Let's take a break real quick here. For those of you who've been watching for a bit, you know I host the Alaskan Journey podcast. I interview people who've recently moved up here to Alaska and discuss what their story has been like and what the challenges were, the tips and tricks they recommend for people wanting to do the same thing. If that's of value for you, do make sure you go check that out in the description section down below. I'll get through this video in the description section down below, in which you can just click on that and go directly to the podcast. Also, if you're considering getting your property on the market in the near future up here in Alaska, do make sure you go to my website and make sure you register and put seller guide in the comments section so I can send you a free resource, which is just the seller guide explaining the steps it's going to take to get your property on the market and to sell. Now, let's go ahead and finish up today's video looking at the Kenai Peninsula in Fairbanks. So the Kenai Peninsula has actually maintained its seasonality the past couple years a lot better than what we saw with the other markets. So it's pretty normal. We'd see like a big bell curve, and during the summertime, you're going to have the most number of properties available on the market during that time. You're also going to have the most number of buyers as well. So it's kind of a wash, really. But what we're seeing is that this time last year, there's about 300 properties that were available on the market in the Kenai, and now it's about 277. So we are seeing a slight drop in the number of properties that are actively on the market, and that's kind of been the same that we've seen across the board for the entire year up to this point. Not surprisingly, we are also seeing that the number of properties that actually sold in the Kenai actually took a bit of a drop as well. It went from about 115 the year before to 99 the next year. So not a huge shift one way or the other, but yes, we are seeing less properties are selling compared to the year before. The next thing that we see is the average sold price in the entire Kenai Peninsula went from about 311,000 the year before to about 342,000 this year, which is actually going to see roughly about a 9.7% increase for the average sold price. So that's doing pretty good. You know, that's not as aggressive as what we see in the MatSu Valley, and they're not starting at the same price point, but you know, overall, we are seeing pretty good appreciation, not as aggressive as we saw in the year before, but that's still doing pretty good. Last but not least, let's take a look at Fairbanks. And Fairbanks, what is going on over there? So we see that this time last year, the number of properties available on the market was about 30, 31, and now it's 131. So what is going on over in the North Pole? Okay, I don't know. I really don't know why they're seeing this huge spike in inventory. If you have some insights on that, I'd love for you to post those in the comments section down below and just kind of hear what's going on the ground, because that's a enormous increase for active inventory. What we're seeing for the number of properties that have actually sold, it's staying pretty consistent right at the moment. There's 26 that sold this time last year, and it's 26 that sold this time this year. Now keep in mind the number of properties that are available on the market, those are going to take a couple months for them to be reflected in the number of properties that actually closed, because it does take on average about 45 to 60 days to actually close. And if you're in Fairbanks, probably longer, just because title companies are going to take a little bit longer. So yes, staying pretty consistent there. The number overall of properties that have actually sold in Fairbanks has historically been higher year over year, just looking at this past year compared to the previous years. But yeah, staying pretty consistent where we were the year before. Average sold price in Fairbanks went from about 288,000 this time last year, about 322,000, 330,000 the next year. So that's actually about an 11% increase, if I recall correctly, which is aggressive. It's not as aggressive as the year before, which I believe was right around 14-15% increase for the average sold price. So what we're seeing across the entire board in Alaska, we are for the most part starting to see kind of a return to the seasonality. It's not quite the piping hot market that we had before, where just like that's all it was. All year was summer. And, you know, it's good to start to see kind of a return to that seasonality, because it means we're starting to get back into a little bit more of a rhythm. And hopefully it means that things are going to start, I'm not going to say settling down, but things are going to start slowing down. So it's not quite at the pace that it was before, because it's good to be in a market that's appreciating well. It's not good to be in a market that's just shooting through the roof way too fast, because that's not good for buyers. It's not good for sellers, believe it or not, because it means that the asset of the property, like the house itself, is in a market that's a little bit more volatile. And what goes up really quickly without really being supported by anything, by any factors, is kind of prone to a lot of volatility. And that's what we see in larger markets like in California, Austin, Texas to a certain extent, the Miami, all these other places with a lot of enormous increase really quickly because you have this huge influx. They're a little bit more volatile, and for the most part in Alaska, that's usually not been the case. We've kind of just been slow and steady going up. So I'm glad to see that things are starting to get pulled back a little bit, and the rate at which we're increasing is still really healthy, but it's not the crazy volatile rate that you see in other places. So I sure hope this has been useful. If it has, give this video a like, subscribe. If you have any questions specifically about any of these areas, do make sure you reach out to me in the comment section down below. Let's talk and see how I can help you. Talk with you later.